Great, thanks very much, Chair, and good morning, everyone. Lovely to see you all back, most of you. So I took on this challenge. I'm going to tell you that I've marked my own homework, and firstly, it was late, and secondly, I don't think I've answered any of the exam questions. So we'll see how this goes. And then I also just did want to preface this by saying that I work on the passenger side, very much on passenger transport. I really sort of try and understand people and demand patterns and how we can influence those and how they change in disruptions. So you'll see through this there's a real thread that runs through, which is about the people in terms of passengers, and that's where my focus is. So, you know, there's lots more that can be discussed. Okay, so first of all, let's just talk about disruptions. So disruption was in my exam question title, and I think it's worth just saying that disruption isn't a given in terms of how it feels or what is a big disruption or a small disruption necessarily to any one part of the system or any one person in the system. And so before we start to think about the solutions, we have to identify what is a problem and what isn't a problem for the different people that we are oriented towards. So we've got to look at who's using them and the cultural context. So just to sort of concentrate the mind, give you an example, there may have been a regular route between two large urban areas with a 2-hour journey time in between. A new motorway was put there, shaved half an hour off of that journey. And then a journey that was 2 hours and reasonably acceptable to people, if it's then disrupted and reverts back to a 90-minute journey, it's suddenly deemed to be a disruption, whereas it wasn't before. And that is something that we constructed within the system, that kind of those new norms, new horizons. So you need to see that in that context. And there's the other way around as well. So some of you may know, unfortunately, the M25 around London, obviously the big circular around London, nobody would expect to be able to go 70 miles per hour around that road anymore, whereas it was built for that, and that was the original expectation, but no one would have that expectation now. So it can go in both directions. But whatever happens, we know that with extreme weather, we're looking at more and more disruption, and particularly with respect to climate change, which is actually going to exacerbate the ones that we already have. Sorry, the reason I'm hesitating actually is because the slides are slightly out of order, and I realise that, but let's me just get on the right page here. This was the first slide, sorry. So and the main point in this slide is just to recognise that although there's lots of attempt at talking about mitigation and adaptation, and there are a variety of mitigation strategies which we'll start to talk about, actually adaptation is still in the sort of theoretical zone, largely. It's certainly under prioritised. But just to skip forward a couple, sorry, it's all coming out in the wrong order. Oh, I hate that. Right. Yeah. So as well as back to my original order. So as well as kind of thinking about disruption as a social construct, we also have to we have to define disruption, think about what it is that we're actually trying to alleviate. But alongside that, the transport system, the reason for the transport system, what the transport system for, is ultimately always what we're doing any of this for. And there are many issues within the system that we want to be addressing at the same time. And I think one of the issues with some of the discussion around the frameworks, maybe I'm sure as well, metrics, appraisal, and so on, get so focused on the alleviation of the particular disturbance that we're looking examining, or we're trying to alleviate the risks of, or second guess where the disruptions are going to be, that I think we can forget what the components of the transport system are, what they're using it for, and what all the other problems are that actually we're ultimately trying to create a better system for. I think my other sort of, it's a very meta observation, but I do think we need to bear it in mind. This came up yesterday, that a lot of the frameworks that were being discussed are very difficult to think about in policy circles, how they would be operationalized. And I think it's maybe a bit harsh, but I think there's an element of sort of analysis paralysis. I'm kind of trying to integrate this area into the mitigation work that I do, because I do think at the overlap, it's the interface, I think, where the really good stuff needs to happen. But I'm frameworked out. I'm definition of resilience out, and I kind of question quite whether that's where that's got us to, all of that kind of focus on the definition. And that's just a challenge. That's not, I'm not trying to be critical or suggest that it needs to stop happening. I'm just certainly haven't yet assimilated it and figured out what I'm taking from it. So I guess that's why we're here, isn't it? We know that we're talking about complex system within systems here, and that the transport system is becoming increasingly complex. We have the interface with the energy system, we have digital infrastructure that is absolutely crucial to the whole system. And at the same time, as it's becoming more complex, we're becoming more dependent on it. So car dependence, the increased complexity of the supply chain. So the system's becoming more complex. We're becoming more dependent on it. And we've, as sort of mentioned before, we then develop our social expectations around a certain level of service or certain ability to have freedom of mobility. And that's very difficult to reverse. But then we increasingly, so we have all of this complexity and dependency, and then we apply very complex analytical frameworks and models and so on to solve these problems. And it's a socio-technical problem, so that it doesn't need complex analytical tools and methods, but we often forget the socio. So we've got, complexity, we use very complex frameworks and models and so on, but we're still not getting it right, because we're not thinking about really how that system's being used, and who's using it, and the activities that are within it. And there's a quote here from an author that just sort of says there's a real risk, you apply complexity to complexity and you get very little, maybe tiny, almost imperceptible breakthroughs in terms of the progress that you're aiming for. Now, again, I'm very conscious that I'm saying these things, and I'm not saying what the solutions to this is, right? So I just think it's worth, given yesterday's sort of focus on that it's worth just sort of lifting our head out and saying, okay, how much more have we got to, what are we still really missing in terms of the tools for understanding before we even get to the tools for implementation. And what we've tended to see coming out of these complex lenses and models with respect to climate change modeling or adaptation modeling, what we actually come out with is very simple tools at the end of it, based largely on a techno fix. So we have all of this complexity, but what we're actually doing is just going for the big hitters in the system, and going for the sort of technological optimism approaches. So the main approaches, certainly with respect to mitigation, has been around managing demand. So trying to maintain the business as usual trajectory, not just the business as usual or the current level of demand, but business as usual trajectory, trying to accommodate that by managing what we have better through kind of a resilience lens, acknowledging that it's a techno fix, but it's demand that we're actually focusing on trying to sort of tweak in order for it to work a bit better. Not trying to really alter the patterns of demand, the level of demand, just try and get it through the system more smoothly and less disrupted, more reliably. And of course, we improve the efficiency of those journeys, both through the vehicles that are used, but also by addressing the pinch points in the infrastructure. We apply a lot of digital infrastructure to that, the whole idea of intelligent transport systems, smart cities, really trying to squeeze as much out, reduce this redundancy essentially, or really try and use the redundancy that's in the system and have a much more efficient way of allocating resources and informing people about it, and also using those systems to inform people of disruption and manage disruption, get people to avoid disruption and so on. And a lot of that is also particularly, well, pre-COVID, but COVID obviously accelerated the trend towards thinking about one big part of the solution can be virtual substitution. The problem with that is that we have not seen virtual substitution. We've seen the increasing integration of digital means of accessing things into our physical system, and that's created new social networks, new business networks, and along with those new networks has come additional physical travel or rearrangement of activities. So the net effect has not actually been demand reduction. Then that's not to say that virtual substitution doesn't happen in a way that avoids certain places and certain times with respect to thinking about disruption. No, I've got them away. Yeah, sorry, just said that on that slide. So virtual substitution is sort of could be seen potentially as moving into an approach towards adaptation, but we have to really try and think: is it really doing that job for us? Is it really moving the system to a position that is more? It may be moving it to be a bit more resilient, but is it actually transforming the system in the way that we think it is? And there's a big sort of along with the techno-optimism idea, there is a real tendency in transport policy to think about the future is really quite narrow terms. Not, I guess this is where that we started yesterday with this idea of not being very imaginative about what the future could look like, or we even would want it to look like, plausibly look like, again, with respect to carbon, the way in which really we're thinking about mitigation, what we're putting first is the quantification of the amount of carbon that we need to reduce. That's completely divorced from what the sort of socio-economic characteristics of the system might be or could be at that level of carbon, at that rate of decarbonisation. So that's sort of real sort of solutionism idea, put the target up front, pick some key measures that actually we know are sort of supposed big hitters, but without any real analysis of how far that will get us in net terms, and what the socio-economic system change as a result of those new technologies or whatever it might be are going to be. So of course we should use everything we have and design the best solutions that we can, that are resilient, from the outset. But we also have to consider that, because we talked a lot about cost benefit analysis, but actually most of the transport infrastructure that will be in place in 2050, say, is in service right now. So we're talking about policies and frameworks and ideas that are about modifying, replacing, reconfiguring, and helping the existing services to be more resilient and adapted. And that's, I think, policy gets hijacked by the new shiny stuff, and the frameworks and appraisal tools involved in that are much more developed than thinking about how to really reconfigure the existing system. But what I will say is that for as much as mitigation is much more sort of developed, certainly in terms of conversation, with respect to transport policy, the level of carbon reduction required is so unpalatable, in the sense of it needing to impinge so heavily on the demand side, that our adaptation actually looks like a more attractive bet. So adaptation at the moment is only really sort of being applied within the transport system in very limited ways to sort of certain big bits of infrastructure. And there's good innovation going on around that, and they're quite highly visible in many cases. But as I just said, it's increasingly likely that actually we're going to look at a world trying to achieve between 2 and 4 degrees, or to limit to 1.5 to 2 degrees. We're going to see that as so difficult that we're actually, I think, almost moving into a mindset where we think adaptation for a 2 to 4 degree world is easier than achieving our carbon targets. And the reason for that, just quickly, in the transport sector, and this again is passenger demand, is that there is not a model now that's being run, whether it's countrywide, regionally, IEA level, wherever it might be, that is not coming out with very significant requirement for reduction in the number of miles travelled by car, in addition to pulling the levers on electrification as hard as they can go. And one of the reasons for that is because the other components of the transport sector, shipping, heavy goods vehicles, etc., are going to take longer. So cars have got more to do in order to sort of compensate for their heavier counterparts. And you just simply cannot make it work without really significant car level reductions in any of the modelling anymore. So that's why it's looking easier to just sort of think, right, well, we're facing a big adaptation challenge here. And this is simplistic in many ways, but I do think it's helpful to concentrate the mind. Essentially, we are only facing 2 different scenarios into the future. So in this diagram, A is going to happen in any case. Okay, so that's a given. We are going to face greater climate change impacts than we are now. But scenario AB1 or and AB2 are mutually exclusive. We can only have one of those. One of them, scenario AB1, is the traffic reduction scenario. This is a scenario where we actually really go for it and we are attempting to meet our carbon targets. And the other one is where we don't meet our carbon targets. Both of those scenarios involve reductions in traffic demand, because a highly, volatile climate and weather extremes are going to reduce our travel demands, and we're going to be forced into that. So one's a proactive scenario and one's a reactive scenario, but they both involve reductions in demand. So then that leaves us with perhaps, really taking that right on as a reality, and thinking about, okay, then how do we proactively design out mobility, some mobility from the system as part of our strategy towards both mitigation and adaptation, in the sense that a mobility system that has lots of different flexibility in terms of multimodality in it is likely to be much more adaptable, as well as if we do it early enough, contributing towards mitigation. So you know, this is hugely controversial, but mobility is wonderful, and this cannot be applied everywhere, as I say on the next slide. But it also can have, mobility can have great potential to add friction into people's lives, add kind of challenges, and particularly when it can't be performed. That's when the real pain actually is felt during disruption. So the dependence on it is actually part of the problem that we need to think about how we can alleviate. And part of doing that is the localization agenda. So this is the idea of sort of proximity-based accessibility planning. It's not a new idea at all, but it can come along with concepts of different norms around the level of mobility, the speed of mobility, the amount of sort of high performing big long distance mobility that's actually acceptable. But it actually involves, unlike we do this in pockets, but we don't have concerted kind of frameworks to plan out travel from our system. And you know, there's there is potential to look at the way in which we use space and you know, use the redundancy again a bit for our advantage. But where we've done that, and there are examples of for instance, Scandinavian countries that have had urban containment policies, really densifying the city, providing good car alternatives for people to live in much denser cities. But at the same time, they've expanded out their regional and long distance transport networks. So from a carbon perspective, certainly that's not actually contributing overall. From a local resilience and from the point of view of providing people with better alternatives and potentially, although not proven, being able to cope with other forms of disruption, particularly regionally planned networks with integrated authorities, then there may be. But from a carbon perspective, we're not actually seeing that those approaches are contributing towards our targets. So that's what I've just said there. Does it work? But we do have an awful lot of other redundants, particularly in the passenger transport system. We know, and it's not something that is sort of accounted for in a lot of the modelling and appraising that we do about adaptation. But there's a lot of private cars that are owned, taking up a lot of space, sitting doing nothing, and using a lot of space on the road as well, as one example. I just pulled up quite an old report now. I think it's 2016 IEA report, Saving Oil in a Hurry. Was not just aimed at the transport sector, but the transport sector sort of comes through in that as having, you know, the quickest levers to pull if needed to be pulled really quickly. And that's because of all of this spare capacity in the system, including things as well like excess speed limits. You know, they're overnight, they can be kind of enforced downwards as a fuel saving measure, for instance. And you know, in this report, obviously it happened during COVID, but there was, you know, not everybody has to go to work or the office every single day. So that's another part of adaptation. I did some work fairly recently with the UK National Travel Survey and sort of reconfigured the survey. It has lots of travel diaries, but what we what we did was actually give each car a travel diary, and just sort of understood the patterning of use of the cars and segmented cars into different lifestyles. It's quite fun, but the headline figure for that is that at the peakiest of peak hour during the week, or this is pre-COVID, Tuesday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, only 14% of the whole car fleet was in movement at that time. So that's that, you know, when you consider that, you know, to be the maximum number of cars on the road. So that's the kind of, that puts a that sort of calibrates it. Recently we looked at, we've had a panel study going all the way since the beginning of COVID. And this I say we, this is my colleague Greg Marsden and myself, and it comes after a study that we did many years ago called Disruption, where we studied people during disruption. We had it was very stressful initially, because we thought, what if we don't get any disruptions to study? But we did. We got strikes, volcanic ash scenarios, and frozen weather and all sorts. And so we studied people in as best we could at the moment to see really what the adaptive capacity was of people and the sorts of journeys that they held dear and would try and do come what may, and how and what kind of adaptive strategies they put into place. That was the Disruption project, but we sort of carried quite a lot of that through all the way through COVID. And this isn't necessarily the best chart. It's the one I could sort of pull off quickly, but, and this has always been the case, pre-COVID or not. When you look under the curve, you look under the average curves, where it looks like everything's very static and, you know, very difficult to shift in terms of trends. There's always upward and downward movements below that curve. And this is car ownership in our study, where more people gave up a car than acquired a car, and in particular more households went from 2 cars down to 1 car. So as a sort of household strategy, and this is partially related to working from home, but as a household strategy, sort of looked at the lower amount of traveling that they were doing and thought, you know what, we don't need that second car. And that's actually, where do you see that in policy? Where is there a policy to actually think, how can we kind of, you know, nudge people, or we need to shove people, but anyway, to sort of think about whether they really need that second car, as a for instance. And what the studies reveal, and this is quite kind of crude way of putting it, but the transport policy focuses on trying to get people to carry on, and the adaptations that are that are thought about in terms of the intelligent transport systems, or whatever the types of information that's put out, or strategies that are put in place to try and alleviate any disruptions. Try and get people to carry on, and okay, maybe they've got to retime their journey a little bit, or swap modes, or reroute. You know, the worst case scenarios, they may have to cancel those trips. But when you talk to people, they're like, well, you know what, we're fine. We don't need, we can shove that to the end of the week, or when the disruption's over. You know, we can actually double up on those journeys. I can send my brother to do that. You know, there's so many more different ways in which people configure their lives. Obviously not everyone has those networks and those resources, but nevertheless, it's the idea is that there are a lot more adaptations that people can make. And the other important thing about the studies, it's very clear that the journeys that are important to people, that they will try and do come what may, are caring duties and important family occasions. If those things are disrupted, they weigh far, far more heavily than anything to do with their work-related journeys. Again, where do we see that in policy or appraisal, etc.? I'm not going to go through this actually, because I want to shut up now, but this again has come out of our COVID study, and just, you know, you have a limited amount of data points that you can put into a survey like this to really understand behavior. But even from that, when you come through and you really try and look at something like what's the net impact of working of this sort of shift towards working from home, you can see how connected up it is into all the types of activities that, well, even just the ones we've managed to measure in the survey. So, you know, people are changing where they're going to send their kids to school. They're sometimes now got time to walk them to school. They're maybe thinking about car ownership levels in their household. They're not passing the supermarket on the way to work anymore, so they're popping out to the local shops a bit more, whatever it might be. That we study working from home. We think, does it save some commute miles? And we get a bit, you know, down at the mouth, because it doesn't save all that much, and also it's had an impact on public transport, and we're a bit negative about it. And yet people are busy reconfiguring their whole lives around this new lifestyle change, and some of it is not carbon neutral by any means. You know, people that do decide to go and live in a more remote area, but nevertheless, the point being that there's so much more adaptation and ways of thinking about how the transport system is used than we possibly ever think about when we're thinking about these things. Okay, so this was my final slide, and it's actually questions on the end which slightly reflect the questions that I didn't answer at all from the briefing note. So yeah, thanks.